Hi, you're with News 9 Live. I'm Karthik Malhotra, and it's never a better time, I feel, than today to be in conversation with the President and CEO of US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, Dr. Mukesh Aghi. Dr. Aghi, thank you so much for joining us on News 9 Live.
Thank you, Karthik.
Like I said, I think the kind of news flows that we are seeing right now, every little incident which is happening in the world or every large incident which is happening in the world at some level seems to boil down to trade relationships between India and US.
Absolutely.
To give you an example, I think data which came in this week clearly suggests that trade between China and US has in fact declined by as much as 20% when we talk about exports from China to US. On the other hand, India's electronics exports have doubled. India's smartphone exports to the US have gone up 5 times. What do you make of data like this emerging in the context of, let's say, Make in India initiative that the Indian government has taken, in the context of trade tensions between US and China, which are escalating now in the context of AI, and overall this global narrative of China plus one, where India seems to be the obvious plus one?
Well, Karthik, what we are seeing is a geopolitics impact which basically rippling down to trade and other transactions. We are very clear that the stress point between US and China will continue. And what we saw in yesterday's election in Taiwan has sent a message also. Now, what's happening is from that perspective, the impact on business community is tremendous.
Right.
You have almost every major US company which has presence in China, either from a manufacturing perspective or getting market access.
Right.
They are getting harassed because of the tension between the US and China as a country. So they are looking at alternative to de-risk their supply chain, and India becomes one pivotal point for them to explore. But more than that, de-risking supply chain, what we're seeing also is that India becomes a market opportunity. You have a $4 trillion economy growing at 7%. In the next few years, it'll become a $5 trillion economy. If you look at the Goldman Sachs report, talk about India having 100 million affluent
That's right.
folks itself.
That's right.
So I think the purchasing power of Indian air, it goes up, attracts more and more international companies, but also provides an opportunity for them to manufacture in India and to send it to the rest of the world also.
That's right. So since you mentioned Taiwan, I think let's really get to that big elephant in the room, which is the Taiwan elections, which have just concluded. And you've got William Lai now likely to take over. He's president-elect. He's going to assume office in the month of May. US heads into elections in the month of November. Now, how do you see some sort of escalation or some sort of a flashpoint actually emerging in the China and Taiwan arena right now, and Taiwan Strait, some sort of military action there? How do you view the situation pre-November and post-November, assuming that pre-November, US may want to be on the sidelines and not really engage itself in an active military conflict if it were to reach that point, and post-November, you don't know which government assumes office in the US?
No, absolutely. When you look at, for US, you got 3 flashpoints at this stage. One is definitely the Ukraine part.
Yeah.
Then you have the Gaza, and now you have the Houthis in Arabian Sea.
Right.
And you have one which could explode potentially would be the Taiwan
Strait.
Now, when you look at the election results, yes, you have a government which came in, which basically is not saying pro-independence, but at the same time, they're also saying that we will not reunify with China.
It's pro-sovereignty, even if they don't want to declare independence, so to speak.
Absolutely.
It is pro-sovereignty.
What is I would say, comforting to the Chinese government is that this government came in with 40% vote.
Yeah.
And Kuomintang basically had almost in the high 20s itself. So they have come with a lesser majority. So from that perspective, I think you will see a little more patience coming in from the Chinese. Now, they may see an opportunity, depending on the internal economic situation also, that while US is preoccupied with its own election, with all the 3 fronts, that it may be time to move in. But my reading is that they will be patient to see how things go on, because with the economy bad, they know that if they move into Taiwan, it will also destroy the economy. So they'll be a little more cautious about it. But you never know what happens.
Yeah, and Taiwan seems to be of absolute central interest both to China and to US, given the trade war on AI, or rather the race for AI between both China and US. And Taiwan, the largest manufacturer of semiconductors, sitting on that technology, on those manufacturing plants, which could aid development of AI in both countries. So how do you see that mutual interest of China and US in Taiwan?
Well, I think the current US government has decided that they will stop movement of high-end chips, anything below 7 nano, going into China. They will stop supplying of any equipment which manufactures that. And so they've made every effort that China does not get. In fact, if you look at Huawei's new laptop which came out, all the chips are being made by the Taiwanese.
Right.
It's not their own product itself.
That's right.
So I think the US realizes that, and it will make every effort to make sure it does not happen. Now, we have seen in the case of Russia, embargoes didn't work.
True.
And the question is, will it work here or not? Time will tell. But I think US is making every effort to make sure that high-end product does not move into China.
And is this the biggest opportunity that India, to your mind, should bank on right now? Semiconductors, India really inviting investments into semiconductors. We've seen Micron promised and has already broken ground, saying that its fab production is going to roll out starting 2025, which is just a year from now. And we've also had visits from the NVIDIA leadership, and we've had the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and the NVIDIA leadership also promising to make investments in India. So do you think the semiconductor opportunity, the manufacturing of semiconductors, is the biggest opportunity for trade ties between India and US going forward?
No, absolutely. If you look at most of the design for chips are already happening in India.
Right.
And basically the fab part is out somewhere else in different geographies. Packaging is out somewhere else. With Micron coming in, step 3 of packaging starts taking place in India itself.
Right.
The question is the fab part.
Right.
So I think as India's economy grows, as India's exports of electronic grows, India becomes a natural place for semiconductor also to come in.
Right.
Will that happen? Absolutely, it's going to happen, because you can't ignore India's growth, you can't ignore India's export. So this is just a matter of time that you will see some of these companies establishing manufacturing in India.
Right. And since we're talking about semiconductors, since we're talking about manufacturing and electronics specifically, India last year did try and experiment with this restriction on import of laptops, tablets, PCs, servers, other IT hardware as we refer to it as. And that, of course, the government then backed down on that decision and in fact went and gave a go-ahead to all importers out there importing from various parts of the world. US at that time did not see India's this restriction on laptop imports or IT hardware imports as being pro-business, pro-US. India seems to be re-evaluating that strategy of holding back the restrictions. How do you see that actually play out in the future?
Well, I think you have to understand the issue is how do you encourage manufacturing in India?
Yeah.
How do you discourage components coming from China?
Right.
And so you have to find that balance itself. By restricting import, will that answer the question on the manufacturing? Probably not. I think you have to have a transition period, work with each and every company that increase your supplies and manufacture your components in India itself, and look at more, I call, aggressive PLI schemes to go in that direction. By putting a barrier, you don't encourage investments into that sector. So I think India did realize that, and I think they're working with the companies, they're working with the US government to make sure that more and more manufacturing happens. And what we have seen is, for example, HP will start manufacturing almost from scratch some of their servers in India itself.
And even the Chinese company Lenovo has pledged to start manufacturing
No,
in
absolutely,
India.
absolutely. So I think we're seeing the ecosystem building up. It will take time, and I think we need to have certain patience to make sure that it comes in from that perspective.
Right.
So I think manufacturing will happen in India.
And how do you see the PLI scheme, looking at it from the outside and looking at it from the point of view of investors wanting to invest in the India growth story by way of manufacturing in India? Do you think the PLI scheme has taken off? Has it delivered on what it intended to deliver on? Or are there some gaps that the government of India still needs to fill when it comes to PLI, especially in electronics, which seems to be an area where India can very easily cover a long distance?
Well, I think in some sector it has worked. Other sectors, we need to improve on it. This is work in progress, but companies do realize that. And I think classic case is Apple. Apple leveraged the BELI scheme, and they're able to basically maintain their margins, what they were getting in China itself, and are able to drive export. In fact, if you look at 3 years ago, Apple had zero manufactured in India. Next year, 25% of Apple 16 will be exported from India. So I think tremendous progress there.
Right. And since we're talking about Apple, let's also talk about other big companies, big corporations in the US, which have been in the news wanting to make an entry into India. And I'm specifically talking about Tesla here. We saw that Elon Musk, in fact, did not attend the recently concluded Vibrant Gujarat Summit. But there have been reports and there have been talks between India's Commerce Ministry as well as Elon Musk's Tesla at various levels, where we have been waiting for Tesla to make its entry into India. Nothing concrete has come out of it yet. India, on its part, wants to soften the deal, wants to make it more lucrative for Tesla to come in by way of reduction in import duties. Do you think Tesla will want to consider India on the terms and conditions which reportedly have been set out by Government of India? And will it really scale up manufacturing in India to continue getting those discounts?
Well, I think at the end of the day, Tesla has to bring return to its shareholders. And if India provides that opportunity for it to be able to manufacture in India, be able to export from India to the rest of the world, then Tesla will definitely come in. I think the biggest issue is that you have over 100% import duty on the current cars.
That's right.
And what they're saying is it'll take them 2 years to get the plant live. And for the next 2 years, make sure that we are able to import those cars and create an ecosystem. Now, the loss to the exchequer, will that basically encourage them to reduce the tariffs on these cars? We don't know, but I think Government of India is working on that, and hopefully they can find a happy medium, because I think Tesla will not is about EV only. They're about storage. They're about mining lithium.
Right.
And each Tesla car has around 2,000 chips.
Right.
It will create the chip ecosystem.
Which is what I think seems to be in India's interest, that you come to India to also develop your own vendor base and have enough and more MSMEs in India engaged in producing each of those little components that go into the Tesla car, and thereby give an overall fillip to the manufacturing sector in the auto space, in the EV space in India.
No, absolutely. When you look at Tesla strategy, was always vertical manufacturing. So they're able to get all of the components locally, make sure that they're able to integrate that locally itself. So I think it'll be good for the country, for the ecosystem, for the technology sector, and also energy transition to have Tesla come into India.
Absolutely. Let's talk about other geopolitical events which are happening in the world and which are actually shaping the global economy. Specifically, two wars already raging on, one between Russia and Ukraine, the other, of course, in the Middle East, or West Asia as we refer to it in India. All of these incidents happening in the world obviously wreaking some sort of havoc when it comes to inflation in the US. Now, the latest attacks by US and UK, the airstrikes and the missile strikes on Houthi rebels in the Red Sea, have actually sent oil prices going up by as much as $4 already in the beginning of this week itself. Now, that is not likely to augur well for inflation in the US. If it doesn't augur well for inflation, we are unlikely to see a rate cut. If we don't see a rate cut by the Fed, then it's not going to loosen the purse strings of American corporations, and India's IT sector will continue to suffer. How do you see this spiral reaching some sort of a logical end in 2024?
You know, we live in a very flux world, and a ripple in one part becomes a tsunami in the other part. And from our perspective, the oil prices going above $80, yes, has an effect on the US economy, but it has a bigger effect on the Indian economy, because we import 80% of our crude.
That's right.
And the inflation becomes more, not just on the oil side, but also fertilizers, and then the vegetable prices go up.
And unfortunately for India, the oil price is not the only problem right now. It's also the Suez Canal, from which most of the oil containers actually flow into Indian shores.
I mean, so you have 15% of the global goods go through the Red Sea itself. And when you basically circumvent that and go through South Africa, Cape of Good Hope, you're adding another 21 days.
That's right.
So your capital is stuck in the container. Containers are not available.
Yeah.
So the cost of shipping goes up, cost of insurance goes up. And I believe with the current scenario, India's export will be impacted by almost $30 billion because of what's happening in the Red Sea. So coming back to the US, yes, it will have an impact. Now with the election coming in, they are very sensitive to that issue. But you also have to understand, US does not import its oil. Most of its oil is self-sufficient.
That's right.
But
And the balance comes from Mexico.
Balance comes from Mexico. Now US has also agreed with Venezuela to open its oil.
That's right.
And so that's also coming along. So I think from our perspective, what I see it is, it does have an impact on the US economy, but it'll have a bigger impact on the Indian economy.
Okay, and with inflation continuing to be sticky in the US, rate cuts are unlikely to happen at least in the first half of the calendar year 2024 in the US. That seems to be the case in India as well. I think the earliest estimates suggest right now that India could see a rate cut would be the second half of the calendar year. So overall, what does this really mean for India's IT sector, where of course our biggest trading partners happen to be the US, and that is where business really flows in from?
Well, when you have a cost of capital so high, corporates basically start saying, hey, let's hold off on capital spending. And capital spending means you're not going to transition to new technology, you will not get new systems itself, and Indian companies do get impacted. If you look at the results of TCS, Wipro, Infosys, we can see the exponential growth which is taking place has tapered down itself.
Right.
It has impact on the EBITDA itself.
That's right.
So I think Indian companies, Indian exports to the US do get impacted. But what we're also seeing is that the efficiency which is driven by Indian companies is needed. And so we will see that some balance coming in. But I think it has impact on US election because the current US market has priced 2 or 3 rate cuts at 50 basis points into the planning. The markets have gone up. That means people's retirement fund, 401k goes up.
Yeah.
That brings confidence to the consumer,
That's right.
and that has impact on the voting pattern. If that gets dampened, then it'll have impact on the current administration in the US.
Dr. Aghi, since we're talking about geopolitics, I think one area where we must focus some energy and attention on is what is happening in the world of the Khalistan movement getting fanned in Canada, which is US's neighbor. And of course, this whole Gurwant Singh Pannu case, which is pretty much happening in the backyard of US. How do you think diplomatically or otherwise India and US should tread that path?
Well, you know, Khalistan is a non-issue in India. You don't hear about that. Whereas in Canada, it has become more of a political issue. In the sense, it's a vote gathering machine. Whoever comes out much more aggressive on Khalistan issue are able to generate more votes. And if you look at NDP, which has 24 MPs, is supporting Prime Minister Trudeau. And I think it's unfortunate. And I think it's immature also on part of Prime Minister Trudeau to come in Parliament and say that I have credible allegation that India was behind the killing of Niger. I mean, you cannot and you should not.
And if you have credible intelligence, why can't we see it? Where is the evidence?
Give the evidence. Now, it's very different in the US. In the US, Panun case came in. Americans worked with the Indians, gave them some documentation, and basically said, listen, our relationship is much, much bigger than this issue. It's a serious issue. We understand that. But we will sandbox that issue so our bigger geopolitical relationship, our economic relationship, and our technology relationship, our people-to-people relationship does not get impacted. So it showed maturity on part of the Americans. It showed maturity on part of Indian leadership to deal with this issue in a very constructive manner. And the Justice Department, as you know, is very independent in the US, especially the Southern District in New York. In fact, they are the one who went and indicted Joe Biden's son also.
That's right.
And so I think you have to understand the justice process will continue, but the relationship does not get impacted because I think we feel that relationship is very important.
Right.
And I commend both the Indian leadership and the US leadership to deal this in a very mature fashion.
So how soon can we actually expect the US Justice Department or even the law enforcement agencies in the US to take some action against Manu, who's openly issuing threat after threat on Indian citizens, on Indian assets?
So I think, you can't justify a threat to a nation on saying it's freedom of expression, it's democracy. I think it's wrong.
Right.
And I think this is much more vicious in Canada. You're having floats showing Mrs. Gandhi's assassination and blood flowing down. That's not acceptable in a civil society, in an educated society itself. Now, that's not happening in the US. In fact, the attack which took place in the consulate in San Francisco, they stopped it eventually. So I think what we are seeing is the noise coming out from Canada is still loud, where noise coming out of out of US is a little more muted. Because I think they realize that you don't want somebody inflaming the emotions between the two countries on this issue of Khalistan, while have a bigger issue between the two countries. How do you create jobs? How do you transfer technology? How do you basically bring global peace across the world? So I think this will get managed. I don't think it'll have an impact on the relationship between the two countries.
Right. So let's talk about, in fact, Indian elections and US elections both. And India is right now just a few days away from the union budget. Of course, this is going to be a vote on account budget. It's going to be an interim budget and not a full-fledged statement of policies that the government would want to initiate. Now, if I can stick my head out and say India's 2024 general election outcome seems to be a little more certain at this stage than that of the US. Now, in this scenario, in India right now, what according to you should be the priorities of the government to get private sector to open up its capex cycle? We've seen that cycle being elusive for the last 3 years or so, in fact, ever since the start of the pandemic, if not even earlier than that. We haven't really seen what we refer to as the animal spirits of corporate India get unleashed yet. And it seems that perhaps they are waiting for that certainty as an outcome of the general elections. For the BJP government in power presently, presenting its budget in a few days from now, what according to you can be done to really get those capital investments by private sector coming in?
I think that's cause of concern because you have Indian investors who are not investing in the country, especially in the capital side. You do have international investors, especially US, sees India as a lucrative market. They see it as a place for manufacturing. They see it as a market opportunity mid to long term. Yeah. So that investment continues to come in. I think from a question in regards to the budget, I think you got to make it more lucrative for the Indian investors to look at India as a destination to invest. Because if you look at the trends last 3 years, that investment is drying up year to year itself. And I think the way to get revive that is make it much more lucrative, that international investment, and hopefully you will see the trend turning around.
Okay. And do you think until that trend turns around, should India continue to bet on government spending and the kind of infrastructure development which is happening right now across the country, as well as consumption, which is about 55% of India's GDP? Do you think these two pillars are enough to carry the GDP numbers, keep the GDP numbers ticking? Because that is one story which the world is really betting on right now.
Well, I think you need more than that. Yes, the government spending is helping. Yes, you have some of the FDI coming in is helping. You need more than that. I think if you're going to maintain a $4 trillion economy above 7%, if you have a vision of a developed country by 2047, you need to keep on having that capital spending continuing substantially, aggressively, and prudently also. So government has to play a very pivotal role to make sure that it keeps on spending from that perspective.
Right. And coming to US elections, this year, again, 2024, we've got half the world literally going into those voting booths and electing their governments. US elections, in the possibility of the Republicans coming to power, how do you see the trade in the world shift in the context of Asia, specifically China and India? If the Republicans were to come to power, do we see China getting favored as an investment destination and as a trading partner to the US as opposed to India?
Well, it's a Republican under Trump which pulled the plug on China, put in 20% tariff on a lot of their goods coming in. So I think they do realize that you can't have a nation, China, taking us almost $700 billion surplus on an annual basis. Yes, they are looking at diversifying because most of the Republicans are business community. They look at less government interference, they look at less lower taxes itself. So I think you will see the stress point with China going up and up. And this is not just Republican. Democrats are also thinking the same itself.
Okay.
Now you may, if the Republicans come in, that you can have a discussion on trade deal happening between India and the US. Under Democrats, because of the union vote, because of other issues, they have been reluctant to talk about trade deal with India. But with the Republicans, there could be a possibility that you can have a trade deal.
Okay. And the Republicans, in fact, Donald Trump himself a couple of months ago also went ahead and said that if he were to come to power, India is going to face retaliatory taxes from the US. Do you think that's practical to do in this environment?
I don't know. You know, politicians make statements, then when reality hit the ground, they change. At the end of the day, if you look at the trade between the two countries, it's $200 billion.
That's right.
India has a surplus of $25 billion, but that can be adjusted. If India instead of buying oil from Iraq, it can buy from US.
That's right.
And that'll get adjusted. So I don't think that's the issue itself. You have to understand the other factor which is taking place is from a technology partnership. India and US are working on AI together. They're working on space exploration together. They're working on quantum computing together. India will manufacture GE engines itself.
That's right.
So it benefits.
In fact, just this week, even Boeing has announced that it's opened a spares plant in the state of Uttar Pradesh in a city called Khurja. And that is actually going to service the maintenance requirements of the Boeing fleet.
You know, absolutely. Absolutely. Because I think you have world-class engineers at 1/10 the cost.
Right.
So why not leverage that?
Right.
It brings more efficiency, more competitiveness to US companies. So I think from that perspective, it will be hard for anybody to come in and stop that by having punitive reaction to India. So I don't think if President Trump comes back, he will go in that direction.
Right. So since we are talking, and before I end, Dr. Aghi, I'd really love to spend a little bit of time on Boeing and what is really happening globally, especially in the US with Boeing right now. We saw recently a door plug literally flying off midair, and this again happens to be the Boeing MAX fleet. However, this is the MAX 9 and not the previous MAX versions, which had been grounded for various other reasons. Boeing seems to be losing its face and the confidence of buyers and flyers across the world. India has large aircraft order both with Boeing and Airbus. Do you think Boeing can come out of the woods just yet?
I think they will. You know, this was a company which is a stellar, known for its quality, innovation, and obviously somewhere it just lost its way. The CEO, David Calhoun, came out and said, we take ownership of this mishap, we work on it, try to fix it. Will it come out? Absolutely. I think at the end of the day.
How soon will it come out? And until then, what do Indian flyers and Indian airlines which have placed large orders with Boeing really do about this whole fear of flying when it comes to Boeing MAX aircraft right now?
Well, I think if you look at India does not have very many MAX 9s.
Not yet.
Not yet. And I think before they take the delivery, they need to have assurances, especially from the Federal Aviation, to make sure that it meets the standard. So I think in any business, you'll have issues and they'll fix it. Yes, this is a high-risk business. I mean, you can't have a door popping up when you're flying 16,000 feet high. Right. So I think it'll get corrected.
Okay. And since we're talking about aviation, Pratt & Whitney yet to set up an MRO in India. That's a dire need right now that India has. What can India do to expedite that?
No, I think there are discussions taking place, especially with Pratt & Whitney to look at India. In fact, they've set up a large center in Bangalore, but more on the other aspect of their technology. It'll come in because you can't ignore India. You have so many of the engines here, especially the Airbus, Indigo has it. Yep. And India can become a very, very cost-effective place to do MRO for this engine itself. Right. Why today they fly those planes into Malaysia, into Singapore to get them serviced, makes no sense.
Absolutely.
So I think that will come in one day. May not be this year, could be next year itself.
Right. Well, let's just hope that it is sooner than next year. But Dr. Mukesh Aghi, pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us here on News 9.
Thank you very much. Thank you.